Welcome to our second community conversation regarding equity and policing, violence, and equality in Grand Rapids. I'm Doug Matthews. I'm your assistant city manager, and I'll be hosting this evening's event. With us, we have Brandon Davis, who's the director of public oversight and accountability. We have Chief Eric Payne, city manager Mark Washington, and deputy city attorney Philip Strong. Before we get started, I want to remind you that you can either call 311 directly, or you can call 456 3000 if you want to get in the queue to register a question or register a comment this evening. Our goal this evening is to get as many comments from the community as we possibly can, answer any questions. You may or may not know that there was a press conference earlier today where we talked about some of the immediate actions that the city is going to be taking here locally to reinforce our commitment to equity and policing. At this time, before we get started, I want to bring Miss Lily Beth Perez on to talk about our interpretation services this evening.
Thank you, sir. If you need interpretation services in order to address our city leaders, I will be able to assist you. Si necesita servicios de interpretación para dirigirse a los líderes de la ciudad, estaré para asistirle.
Thank you. Before we get started, I mentioned that we had a press conference earlier today. We thought that it would be good for us to start by running through some of the things that we've heard from the community, not only over the past few weeks, but as we've continued to work to improve our policing and some of the actions that we plan to take here in the immediate term and over the coming months to further improve on that work. To do that, I want to introduce City Manager Mark Washington to give us an update on where we are.
Thank you, Mr. Matthews, and I want to thank the public for their continued participation in this very important policy discussion and dialogue as we continue to try to make the change that's needed. We are all trying to interpret our emotions as it relates to the horrific death, the murder of George Floyd, and how this has opened our eyes internationally to the institutional and individual racism that exists throughout this country and throughout the world in some places. And certainly we here in Grand Rapids want to be very deliberate about this work and making sure that we do what we can to undo racism and these systems that have been in place for a long time. We remain committed to this work. I know that even tonight, some of the things that you're hearing, making sure that our public meetings are inclusive and we have language access services that you've heard this evening, or the fact that you're going to hear from our new Oversight and Accountability Office and other things are indicative of the progress that we've made here in Grand Rapids. But we know that no matter how far we come, there's still quite a bit to go, and we are willing to acknowledge that, and we're willing to take on the challenge to improve our department. Appreciate the feedback that I have gotten since the 31st or the first when we first started after response from the issues over a week ago last Saturday. We began quickly not only thinking about recovery in terms of how we restore community, but restore trust in our community, and have had several good meetings with community members, as well as the town hall that we had last week, and we've listened. And you'll hear about tonight some of the added things that we were able to share this evening that we weren't able to do. And earlier today, as Ms. Matthews said, that we had made some decisions. I made given some direction to our staff on things that I'd like to see us implement now, near term, and over the next between now and the next 60 days, and then other things that will require a little bit more work that are either big policy work that requires funding, legislative issues, or other legal matters that we'll have to navigate through. And so we'll cover that now. The intent tonight is to continue to get feedback. We are continuously improving and learning. I did share our progress with the City Commission before tonight's meeting. And my intent is anything that we learn over the course of our conversation this evening may impact the conversation we will have on Tuesday with the commissioners on June the 16th during CAL. So those of you who are watching this evening, I invite you to continue your engagement during that meeting as well. So with that, I am going to ask our staff to walk us through it. Unfortunately, our city attorney, Ms. Anita Hitchcock, could not be with us this evening, but I want to thank her deputy city attorney, Philip Strum, for being able to participate. But as we begin, I guess we'll turn it over to Chief Payne at this time.
Thank you, City Manager. As I've said before, I have talked to law enforcement in our region here, across the state, law enforcement executives, and actually law enforcement executives around the country. And the discussion has been around the tragic death of George Floyd. And I have said that in our communications, everyone agrees that his murder, and it was a murder that officer has been charged with, former officer has been charged with, will be in vain if we don't take a deep look at law enforcement and how we're doing things and how our directives are. So with that, we are committed to taking a deep dive into our policies and procedures and improving them and making sure we are responsive to what has been asked, but making sure that we continue to serve the public and keeping officers safe in a safe manner. So I'll start with improved use of force policy by explicitly banning chokeholds in our use of force policy. We're looking to improve policy requiring officers to de-escalate situations where possible by communicating with subject and maintaining distance, otherwise eliminating the use of force. We're going to look to require officers to give verbal warnings in all situations, whenever possible, before using deadly force, and require officers to exhaust all other reasonable alternatives, including non-force and less lethal force option, before resorting to deadly force. We're going to improve our policy by requiring officers to intervene and stop excessive force used by other officers, and will report these incidents immediately to a supervisor so officers that will be held accountable. Update the policy on banning officers from shooting at moving vehicles. This is something that's has been in our policy, but we're going to look to move that into an area where it fits with our use of force policy also. Make sure all uniform officers have names and badges on all their uniforms while in public. This will include events involving civil unrest. Just on that, there was a thought that officers shouldn't have shiny objects on them. After talking with our staff, we feel that that is not necessary as much anymore. There are ways of getting identification on officers, even during civil unrest, so that they're readily identifiable as police officers and also their name. We will be making that adjustment also. And I believe Mr. Davis will take the next slide.
Apologize for the delay. The technology wouldn't let me unmute, but just give me 1 second here. Okay. So on the next slide, you see additional directives that have been given by the city manager. Those directives include ensuring that the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability reviews and releases a comprehensive report related to all of the studies that have occurred in Grand Rapids over the last several years. We recognize that there have been several studies, and we will be releasing a report related to where the city stands on those recommendations and future steps within the next 30 days. Additionally, the commitment is to continue to make structural changes to the Grand Rapids Police Department and to address those recommendations that were in the deployment study, the Lambert traffic study, and the 21st century policing report. More civilian employees are needed in the public information and senior administrative roles. We'll also identify funding to expand the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. The city manager has asked the chief to assist in this funding initiative. We'll also establish a community police advisory council that provides ongoing support and advice to the police chief on plans, strategies, and policies. We'll increase and enhance training offered by the Office of Equity and Engagement and the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. And that training will be related to equity, justice, implicit bias, and other related topics for all city staff, including police. We'll also be working with the Economic Development Department, our community's children, the Office of Equity and Engagement, and the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. And we'll be working with the business community to increase summer job opportunities for youth. Additionally, the city manager has directed that we collaborate with community to support programming that provides information and awareness related to allyship. We've heard continued concern or questions from community of how do I support, how do I stand as an ally? And we want to work with community to help identify ways that that information can be provided. We'll also improve resident engagement by creating more opportunities to represent groups, to promote safety and accountability, and to prevent crime. The Office of Equity and Engagement will host an event in partnership with my office led by subject matter experts regarding processing and healing from trauma and from vicarious trauma related to racism and use of force. We'll create pathways for ongoing input and support from the community for the plans, strategies, and tactics of the Grand Rapids Police Department. And we'll also continue to complete the Office of Oversight and Accountability's strategic plan and implement additional strategies to increase restorative justice programming, elevating community voice, and public safety engagement. In addition to that, we'll ensure the police department works with the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, the Human Resources Department, the Grand Rapids Public Schools, colleges, community organizations, and labor groups to increase efforts in recruiting more diverse candidates to serve in our police department. And at this time, I'll turn it over to the Assistant City Attorney.
Thank you. On behalf of the City Attorney and the Department of Law, I do want to reiterate how committed we are to helping advance the issues that were just laid out by Chief Payne and Mr. Davis and the City Manager. In addition to those items, our office is hearing the voice of the public, and we understand how urgent real action is. And so we are working around the clock with our staff of attorneys to help advance those items. For today, our purpose is to talk about some of the considerations that may require some additional time. So we are providing reasonable expectations to the community. And some of those items are innovating and advocating for more open public meetings for labor negotiations. And while these may have been closed previously, we're trying to come to a consensus as we enter into those negotiations on a process that can be done so more open and transparent. While this cannot be done unilaterally, we certainly can try to find innovative ways to encourage that. And we are doing that together with the other departments that have spoke today. We're also looking at expanding the power for the Civilian Appeals Board, and particularly how do we allow for more subpoena powers to independent areas of our government in our city. And so that is a complex issue, and we are doing the thorough legal research that would be required. We're also weighing that together with the action that's being done in the state department as they review ways that the state may also be involved in these sorts of matters. Settlement with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. This is an ongoing issue that we take very seriously, and we are fully compliant and working in cooperation with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights to resolve a number of issues and implement potentially some recommendations that they have However, this is not at a point right now where we're able to make too much of a comment on it, and it requires decision making outside of the attorney's office. So we will continue to try to resolve that in a way that's fair and reasonable under the circumstances. And finally, redirecting funding from police towards economic development, housing, and other community programs. We're aware of the conversation nationally about police funding, and we are also working under state law and the charter to determine whether or not that's an option. And if it is an option, how would we accomplish that in a way that would make sense for the city of Grand Rapids? And so those, again, are decisions that are not necessarily made by the Department of Law, but we can help advise on legal options depending on the circumstances to help evaluate those particular community requests and internal requests for legal opinions.
And just before Mr. Matthews takes over, I just want to add my thanks to all three of those gentlemen that presented, and then elaborate a little bit more on the last slide on particularly the budget option. The city just recently adopted our budget on May 21st. As part of that adoption, we reduced the budget by 22 million, and the police department's budget was also reduced during that course of time. That budget is set to be effective July the 1st. So again, we're in the middle of a recession, and we're also in the middle of heightened need for public safety, particularly police. Much of the activities over the week have required additional resources from the department, and our overtime costs, the total cost from the recent damage cost from rioting is right now is around a couple of million, and of that, about $500,000 is policing costs. So while there's requests to either decrease the resources for law enforcement, the reality is the cost continues to go up, even in light of the need for officers to be present to make sure our city remains safe during these very difficult times. So we will be having those policy discussions, particularly on the latter. The last four are ones that are beyond just operational decisions from my authority, the chief, or the manager's authority, and requires the legal or fiscal work or legislative work to get done. And so I just want to make sure that the public understands that before they start to comment. Mr. Matthews?
Thank you, City Manager. Thanks to each of you for your roles in this. Just very quickly, I did want to mention to Patrick and Jessica and Kyle and Sharon and everybody else that's watching on YouTube. We are following all of the comments that we receive, and in fact, Mr. Davis's office has been collecting those comments and logging them so that we can review those and report back or take action if it's necessary. We have 4 callers in the queue right now. There's some of the threads that we have going on YouTube right now, I think, are worth providing a little bit of clarification. One of the questions was about shouldn't these policies have been in place all along? And I know there have been discussions throughout as we've talked about this, where, Chief, you've mentioned that some of these things we don't train for, we don't allow, but there's benefit in being more discreet and more specific in the policy because that's part of the accountability process. So can you just talk about that a little bit before we get started?
Absolutely. Like the chokehold, that is not a trained technique that is authorized by a Grand Rapids police officer since I've been here. But what we're looking to do is to put that into policy so it's clear, so the public can understand that is something that is banned in the Grand Rapids Police Department. And also the verbal commands. Those are written up in our training memorandums whenever we do training. It's not necessarily in our policy. So it's those type things that we want to get into policy to make sure that that's how our officers are trained or not trained. So it's clear to the public on how or when how officers are directed to use force.
Okay, thanks, Chief. Mr. Davis, can you talk about the role that policy plays in the review and the accountability process?
Sure. So policy plays a very important role in the review and accountability process as we talk about what we can hold officers responsible for, or if we can hold them responsible for policies that have been created and rules and regulations that have been created. The nature of government is that there has to be policy in order for there to be checks and balances. So when we look to want to make things change or we want to improve something, the way we improve it, at least initially, is by creating policy that mandates it. And once we have a policy that mandates it, then we can implement that policy and make it a part of the culture of the organization. And that's true for the Grand Rapids Police Department, as well as the city of Grand Rapids, or any type of governmental structure that you work within. It is laws and policy that we can hold people accountable to.
Thank you. So, Mr. Start, can you bring in our first caller?
Can do. Caller, welcome to the forum. If you can turn down your volume in the background, you have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to start out by saying thank you to the Grand Rapids Police Department. Even prior to the events of the last couple of weeks, very unfortunate events, our neighborhood has had great communication with the police department, has been available, made themselves available for questions, and it's a very difficult job. And I just want to say thank you very much and start the conversation on a very positive note. My question is, why is there even a discussion about redirecting funds or defunding police funds at this point? Given the events of the past couple of weeks, I think there's neighborhoods in Grand Rapids that could benefit from extra police protection. And I'm very disappointed that this is the direction of our conversation. I'm wondering what I can do as a citizen to, in addition to this phone call, make that point of view heard. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. Appreciate those comments. Can we move on to our next caller?
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Okay, I'd like to know, when the walk on Saturday was peaceful and walkers saw containers of bricks, why didn't the police do something? They acted too slowly, and if they can't control downtown Grand Rapids, how can they control the rest of Grand Rapids? And I do think we need more policemen. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. Chief, I'm not sure I understood the question there.
Chief, you're on mute. They were asking about the incidents from this past Saturday and why didn't the police interact sooner? So just before I go, Ms. Matthews, so are we just taking calls and going to answer later, or are we answering each one?
We're going to take as many calls as we can. If there's any comments or questions that we feel like we need to take a pause for,
okay,
we'll take a pause to get to those.
All right, we'll let the chief answer that one, and I want to go back to the first caller about the question, why is the narrative around defunding now? Go ahead, Chief.
Yeah, on the events of that night, that was unprecedented. And it really came down to having the resources to be able to effectively and safely make arrests as the peaceful demonstration or rally turned into an unlawful assembly or riot. it was a matter of resources and for officers to attempt to make arrests in a safe manner. And that's a safe manner for the officers and also for actually those protesting. As we got more and more resources available, officers over the course of that night, we were able to disperse the crowd and eventually make arrests. But initially, it was a matter of resources.
Then I'll just add to the respond to the first caller about the conversation around defunding or dismantling. I think the narrative around that started with the city of Minneapolis in their wrestling with local response on how to address reform in the police department. And so those are some of the policy things that they're considering. And I know that there were some statements that were made or aspirationally. And I don't know the latest as of today on what their specific plans are, but I think other cities around the country, large cities, have also reallocated some funding, like Los Angeles, a portion of the department's budget. I want to keep in mind, even what LA did is not defund the department. They reallocated a significant portion for other uses. But this conversation around are we over policing? That is not a new conversation, and cities have long looked at the resources that are committed to the police department and see if those same resources could be allocated in other ways to achieve similar or better results in a non-traditional way. That is either community-oriented policing or ways of addressing some of the other socioeconomic issues that cause crime. And then because there's crime in areas of poverty, areas where there's disproportionate housing or health issues, you have these higher incidents of police response. And so those are some of the conversations that have been circling for a while. The new narrative around defunding is one that I think has only begun to recently get more national attention. Even though there are departments that have done it in the past, they have done it either by merging with other units of government, or you've seen police and fire departments merge, or you've seen local entities become metro entities, or vice versa. You've decoupled. You'd have metro entities where cities have grown and says, well, I don't want to be part of this bigger department. I want to have my own police department. And the chief may be familiar with other examples of that around the country as
well.
No, I think you go ahead.
Go ahead, Chief.
No, I think you covered it very well, and it's worked both ways where departments have consolidated and then departments broke off from that metro type of concept. So that's been around for a long time.
Okay. Well, we have 12 callers in the queue, so we're gonna move on and get some comments in.
Caller, welcome to the forum. If you could turn down your volume in the background. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Wonderful. So I am calling today to ask, what are the steps going to be taken to defund the GRPD? I'm extraordinarily disappointed and disgusted at the GRPD's action. I hope we have all seen the viral video of a cop just smashing some tear gas into the face of an innocent protester. And I was one of the attendees of the protester this weekend and noticed that all of the badges of the police officers were completely covered up. This is illegal, I'm pretty sure. And it's baffling to me that we spent $56 million to fund the GRPD and they can't even follow basic guidelines. Why is there no training? This is a high-stress job. We're paying them so much money and they can't even keep their act together for innocent protesters. It's deplorable, to be entirely honest. So I would really like to know what the next steps are going to be to get the budget down for the GRPD. 32% of the Grand Rapids budget is still the most paid department in the entirety of Grand Rapids, and that's 32%. So what are we going to do to lower that as well? Because it's disgusting. You guys are setting up anti-homeless obstructions under
Thank you, caller.
Okay, thank you. City manager, I believe, spoke to a little bit of the funding issue just a second ago. Let's move to our next caller.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Okay. When will the policy change where the police officers can get a psych exam before they're hired? That's number one. Number two is how can a person get involved with the policy advisory or citizen of appeal board? Number two. And the third one is there objections to citizens to start wearing body cams? That's all I want to know because I'm concerned about my grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Is that the one that we wanted to speak to?
Yeah, I can speak to at least two of those questions that were raised. Psychological exams are required. We send potential recruits to a psychologist and they are administered a battery of tests prior to them being hired on the police department. As far as the body cams, citizens have rights to photograph and videotape officers and their actions, with the caveat to not to interfere, but I welcome people to videotape our officers. It's another form of accountability. I just would caution them not to interfere, but those are the two I can answer to. And maybe Mr. Davis can speak about the CAB.
Sure. And Chief, after that, there was still that outstanding question about the badges. I think we should speak to that as well. So as to the Civilian Appeals Board, in order to participate on the Civilian Appeals Board, you need to be a Grand Rapids resident, and you can apply online. If you go to the city's website, there is a way for you to get involved with that. You can also call 311, and they'll be able to talk you through that process to be a part of the Civilian Appeals Board. And we would love to have people apply for those positions.
Yeah, as far as the badges moving forward, officers will have their name plate and badge displayed on their outermost garment.
Thank you, Chief. Let's get to our next caller.
And I guess, yes, thank you.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now. Caller, are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I think my YouTube stream is a little behind.
Oh, no worries. Go ahead. You have 3 minutes for your question.
Thank you. Well, I have something else I wanted to say, but I guess I'm going to start with, I think Chief Payne mentioned earlier that part of the reason that the police behaved as they did during the so-called riots a couple weekends ago was that they could make effective and safe arrests. And I got to say, on Chief Payne, you've got an awful lot of gall to say that in order to make an effective arrest on the rioters, you had to roll out a whole bunch of gas on a whole bunch of people who weren't doing nothing. I was right up there on the front lines with my hands up, surrounded by about 100 other people with our hands up, and you rolled a bunch of canisters right under my legs. I watched a woman I was standing right next to have a darn near life-threatening asthma attack as a result of it. And I just find it a little disrespectful that you would call that an effective and safe way to break up a protest that was by and large peaceable. And I think that highlights my concern in chief here, which is that I don't know that we as a city are any safer because we have a police force that has access to that kind of tactics. We have people rolling out there loaded for bear. It's completely unnecessary. That kind of method of policing, I don't think has been shown anywhere to make people more safe. It is one of the easiest changes to make, is to demilitarize the police. And I'm not seeing anybody even discussing it. And that's, I guess, my concern right now. Is there any plan to return the kind of gear and stop the kind of tactics that we saw that, frankly, were the kind of jackbooted stuff you would see in some kind of third world country? I guess that's all I have to say. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, caller.
So there have been a number of comments and questions coming through in regards to what's been referred to as the militarization of police, and a related comment about what we can do to look at what other departments are doing to reduce that militarization, either through budget practice or policy. So I thought maybe we'd want to address that.
Yeah, and I think the chief as well. I've gotten a couple of questions about tear gas, just like the caller has asked, and why would that quote unquote less lethal force be used? When is it appropriate? What's the best practice around it as well, Chief? If you can address that as well.
Yeah, just as going back to this was a peaceful rally that turned unlawful. The tear gas was not utilized until rocks and bottles were being thrown at officers. There was an attempt to take over a vehicle surrounding officers. There were looting that had started to take place. At that point, this becomes an unlawful assembly, and directions were given to the crowd to disperse, that it was an unlawful assembly. And when that did not occur with the looting and different damage that was being done, that's when the decision was made to utilize tear gas to disperse the crowds. But that's something that was not done immediately. It was done after warnings were given and other criminal acts started to take place.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Davis, from a policy standpoint, there's a lot of folks discussing that we need to be looking at best practice departments. And I know that that's been a big part of your ramp up with your position. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I do think it's important that we continue to look at all of the policy of the Grand Rapids Police Department and look for best practices, but look with an eye for equity and innovation. So as we stand here today, there are policies in place, but we have to look at the policy and say, what are the outcomes of those policies, not just the intention. We can't rely on intention alone. If there are disparate outcomes to policy, we need to address those outcomes and see how we change the policy to ensure that we don't have those disparate outcomes. And we have to recognize that that is a process, but it's a process and it's an urgent process. And to that end, that's one of the reasons the city manager has directed my office to work on those things.
Okay, thank you. So let's move on to our next caller.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes for your question. Your time starts now.
Okay, how you doing? My name is Michael, and I'm basically just want to bring to the attention. It seems like the past few years we've been having a spike in police brutality and excessive force cases and just things of that nature. And it seems that Grand Rapids Police Department, Sheriff's Department, the DEA in Kent County or whatever, it seems like they're exempt, from facing consequences when they, act on Black individuals. It's been a lot of recent cases, and one in particular is 2017, Yusef Latif Phillips, who was shot by Andrew Hines. And no charges was filed. Of course, Mr. Phillips, he was a alleged drug dealer at the time, but he was unarmed, and he was shot in the chest with a rifle. And no consequences were taken against Officer Andrew Hines, and nothing was done. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
And we've still got about 2 minutes if you want to continue.
Oh, yeah, and it just seems like, I don't understand it. Just because an individual commits a crime or allegedly commits a crime, that doesn't mean they have to be shot or excessive force has to be used, And like I say, it seems that Grand Rapids or Kent County, so to speak, are exempt from facing any consequences behind actions, And I just want to bring that to the attention of everybody and, maybe some people can, take a better look, or some more powerful people can take a better look at, things that's happening in our community in Grand Rapids. And that's basically all I want to, bring to the attention of everybody. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thanks for the call. Doug, let's get to our next caller. I believe we have about 24 people right now.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now. Are you there, caller?
Sorry, I had myself muted. Yeah, just a couple of things I wanted to ask about, and if I missed these previously, I apologize. But you mentioned that there would be a study done within 30 days to make recommendations regarding changes to lessen racism within the force. And I'm of the opinion that these studies should be done at least yearly, and progress reports should be provided quarterly to the public. But on that topic, who is part of that Office of Accountability? Are they ACLU members or some other experts that have experience with racial diversity and institutional racism? And then also, you mentioned policy changes with regards to training to specify more racial equality and things like chokeholds, but what actions are being taken to look back at those officers that have a history of excessive force complaints? I would think that we'd want to go back years, preferably, to see, are these things that we are trying to address right now keeping officers in place that should have been removed prior? If we're going to make changes going forward, I think we should also look back so that we can correct errors that have been made in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. Well, I can say that one of the goals of the objectives that we put together is to tie it back to the strategic plan so that there's very specific measurement of the results that come out of that. It's also part of the reason that we have an Office of Oversight and Accountability now. So, Mr. Davis, do you just want to speak to that briefly?
Sure. So, Assistant City Manager, you're exactly right. A big part of the reason that our office is here is to build additional accountability and transparency. The study that's being spoken to, there were a series of studies that happened in the city of Grand Rapids. Actually, the majority of which before both City Manager Washington or myself were here and serving in these capacities. However, we recognize that it's important to be accountable to the studies that have already been done. So to that end, what the study is going to do, or what this research is going back through all of those studies to check out the recommendations, see what we committed to, and see where we are related to those recommendations. And then my office will also opine about where we should be in next steps related to that.
Okay, thank you. So let's move to our next caller.
And before we do that, and I think you were concerned about the qualifications. And so since I recently appointed Mr. Davis, who is both a labor relations professional as well as an attorney with a background in criminal justice, I think he is able to help us opine on some of these issues.
Absolutely. Mr. Stark, can we get to our next caller?
Caller, welcome to the forum. If you have 3 minutes for your question, your time starts now. Can you turn down your volume in the background? Awesome.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello?
Yep, you're on. Go ahead.
Okay, I am wondering what is the difference between the Civilian Complaint Committee and the Oversight Committee? And two, how do we make sure that the people on the Oversight Committee are representing the people of the city? Should these be elected positions? And third, I am concerned about the militarization of the police department. I understand a lot of this equipment came free or very cheaply from the government and from Army zones. I don't think we need this type of equipment on any of our American streets. And I'm very concerned about the message it portrays and how it is really it's very intimidating and fearful. And I was at the march each of the last 2 weekends. I left before it escalated at the first one, and then last week I was there, and just the barricades, dump trucks, and police in full riot gear, and it was completely peaceful, and even a sit-down conversation where the protesters or marchers sat down in front of the police. So the military equipment just seems to escalate things. and I would think we want to de-escalate situations. And finally, my concern is how can we bring social workers and mental health community workers into some of these situations where the police are not necessarily equipped to handle or necessarily are not specialized in that area, and they don't need to be handled with any type of violence or with guns present. How can we diversify the police or how we care for our citizens? Thank you.
Thank you. So we brought this up before, and there's quite a bit of conversation about it. So I want to bring it back to the conversation. This conversation about militarization of the police and what equipment, what tactics may be used. I know that that's difficult to address comprehensively in this kind of a format, but I feel like we need to provide some information to the folks that are watching, to the folks that are calling on that issue specifically, if we can, Chief.
Sure. As far as weapons or any type of vehicles, there are departments that utilize, I believe they're kind of classified as military surplus. Grand Rapids Police Department has never utilized that option. Other departments do. We have, I believe we've gotten some medical supplies from the military, but to the point of what we do have, we have to make sure we have the capability to address any concerns that are threats that may materialize with us. We're all issued sidearms, but what we're finding more and more is that the threats that we may confront, people are carrying much more dangerous weapons. We have been extremely fortunate, but if you look at the school shootings, a lot of times military or rifles are used during some of those school shootings. So what we have to do is make sure I'm equipping my officers and more importantly, training them to utilize those weapons that they have so they're using them properly.
Chief, so there was another side to that question, and I know that it was something that we talked about. We talked about going into last year's budget, and it's something that you've been working to staff up, and that is the other side of this, which is the social working, dealing with people with mental health crises and things like that, which is a critical component of some of the issues that we deal with. And I feel like we need to talk about that piece as well, not just what we've done in the present, but what the intent is moving forward. That includes the community policing, of course, in the evenings, which is something that started this past year.
Absolutely. Thanks for reminding me. We've established a second shift community police officer whereas before we only had daytime. So now we have a second shift community police officer, and that was made we were able to do that by transitioning officers that were in sworn positions back to patrol and utilizing civilians. But one of the things out of the COVID-19 is something we were discussing, and we have implemented our heat team or hot team that are working specifically with the homeless, where we dedicate a police officer and a firefighter to interact with the homeless community and try to get their needs met. One of the things we're looking to do is add other components to that team, which would be social workers, mental health experts, and expand that as much as we can. So that's what we're looking to do with the homeless. And finally, part of this year's budget was the addition of civilians that will be utilized they deal in trauma. We hired an internal person to work with police officers to make sure the police officers are in their right place to go out and serve the community. But we also hired an external person, a person that will respond with us to critical incidents where violence has occurred, and to assist those employees or those that have been subjected to that trauma and try to get them resources. And, that person has come on board in the last month. We're looking to utilize them more, and they will be out in the community.
Thank you, Chief. I do want to take a second before we go to our next call. Every question that we get, we log, and every question that we get, we're going to make an effort to answer. We are trying to maintain a balance between making sure that we get as many voices heard as we possibly can, and taking some meaningful time to be able to address some of the questions. So if you've logged a question or a comment on Facebook, if you've logged a question or a comment through the YouTube channel, if you're on the phone and at the end of this we haven't been able to get to you, please stay on, because we want to make sure that we get that information as well, so that we can consolidate that information and we can provide a meaningful response. So please know that we are listening and we do intend to answer. Mr. Stark, can we get to our next call?
You bet. Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes for your question. Your time starts now.
Thank you very much. Bob Cooper is my name. I know from the news over the last few weeks that there are a number of communities or a number of cities in the country that have done studies on their police to find out what the percentage of use of force or situations in which they think they might use force is. And I'm just wondering if the city of Grand Rapids has done that, if they have thought about limiting the number of times that the police go out with weapons, and is, for example, a licensed and proper protest might be a good time for the police not use their weapons at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to our next caller.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Thank you. So I am calling to add my voice to the chorus, calling for the ultimate goal of defunding GRPD. And I have 2 questions related to that. The city manager keeps belaboring the point that the budget that goes into effect on July 1st has already been adopted. My understanding is that the city commissioners have the authority to call an emergency meeting and reallocate some of those funds before July 1st. So my first question is that accurate? And my second question is, could someone describe the process that would be required to change the city charter so that 32% of the city's budget does not have to go to GRPD? Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Okay, why don't we, I saw Mr. Strong, you came on. I don't know if you want to speak briefly to the charter question. That's not a short one to be able to answer.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. The charter revision process is governed by state law, and it first requires a vote by the people to form what's called a charter review committee or commission. It also can be done by petition, but if a commission is formed by election of 2/3 of the majority of the board, then commissioners need to be elected at that same time to fill those roles. It's common to take 18 months or more to actually have a revision process take place. There are other ways through amendment and otherwise to change some portions of a city charter, but that's kind of an overview. It's a state law that requires a vote of the people after a decision of the governing body by 2/3 or a ballot initiative.
Thank you. Mr. Washington, do you want to speak to the budget question?
Sure. So in response to the caller, the commission meets on the 16th, and we do budget amendments at any time, but a significant budget amendment like defunding an entire department is one that we certainly as staff could not prepare for by the meeting on the 16th, such a significant operational change. And it's not only the fact that you would defund something, but you need to make sure you have things to replace it by such time. And just as our duty as staff is to do professional policy analysis and preparing for our decision makers. And I am unable to make such recommendations, not only to take away funding, but also to have replacement programming in such a short period of time without jeopardizing the public health and safety of the community. So whatever we take away from the police department, we would want to make sure that there's no risk to any type of services that they're offering. And with those calls for total defunding, I'm just unable to make that kind of recommendation to them on the meeting on the 16th. Now, certainly that's the reason why we have a democracy, and this is not solely such policy decision like that's not solely mine. And so I welcome the caller to also contact his elected officials and participate in the meeting on the 16th.
Thank you. Mr. Starr, let's get to our next caller.
You got it. Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes for your question. Your time starts now.
Hi, I'm calling to say I, for one, and many others are quite disappointed in how our police department is being vilified. I think they're doing a great job for very little money and very little respect. In regards to the rioting and looting, that started out as a peaceful protest. It evolved into something a lot worse. Why were the peaceful protesters not helping the police try to stop those people just out for fun and creating as much havoc as they could? Muskegon seems to have been better prepared than their leaders were anyway. They had a peaceful protest and they didn't have any rioting afterwards, and they were, I think, expecting that. I also wanted to say, in regards to those who want to defund the police department, let's see how many of those people would like to have a person possibly breaking into their home, call the police, and have no one available. I think we need every one of our police officers. They go through a lot of training. I also wanted to comment on OPA's, Mr. Davis's comment on during the press conference this afternoon, where he said how disappointing it was when he was a young man and learning to drive, and his mother told him, respect the police. If they pull you over, keep your hands on the wheel, let them know you're not a threat. Well, that's not just Black people, that's everybody. My parents told me that. I'm a white woman. I told my girls that when they learn to drive. It's common sense. These people are approaching a situation where they don't know what could happen, and it's just common sense. Be respectful. They're doing their job, and they'll clear it up, and don't be any kind of a threat. I just want to give kudos to our police department. We can't be without them, and those who think we can would get a rude awakening if that ever happened. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you for the call.
Mr. Matthews,
Let's
if I
move
may.
on. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I think it's important. I want to give all due respect to the caller, but I want to be clear about the experience of Black people in America. And I respect the idea of being respectful to police. And in fact, I believe in that wholeheartedly, but we cannot just allow conversation to just breeze past the experience that African Americans in particular have had as it relates to racism in America. We can't breeze past the experience of being treated differently as institutions and systems being created to treat people differently. So when we talk about, or when I talk about the conversation that has to be held, or the conversation that my mother held with me and the conversation that I have to have with my children about making sure that you are respectful, it's so that you come home alive is the reason my mother had that conversation with me. But with that being said, I do believe in respect. We believe in respecting law enforcement. I believe in respecting everyone. And I appreciate the men and women who serve our community. But we have to understand the history of America, and we can't hide the history. In order for us to heal from where we are and move forward, we have to recognize what the experience has been in this country and recognize that there is a need to make change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. We move on to our next caller.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes for your question. Your time starts now. Are you there, caller? You're breaking up. Are you there?
Caller, you're breaking up quite a bit there. If you can call back in, hopefully we can get you back in, get you in front of the queue. No, we've got still 28 people on the line, so why don't we move on to the next one and hopefully we can get them back.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes for your question. Your time starts now.
Okay, first of all, I want to reiterate what a lot of people have said thus far, and I'm just fed up with the militarization of the police. You guys should absolutely not be gassing your own citizens. It is disgusting. Okay, moving past that, I'm going to bring up a couple of instances that previous callers have talked about. They talked about the hiding of badges and name tags, and then the launching of a tear gas canister from close range against a civilian. And all I've seen on this is like, oh, we're looking into the incident and we're investigating. Who is investigating? Who is policing the police? I want to know who were the officers involved, and I want to know what steps are being taken to charge these people with crimes or whatever. I mean, there needs to be some accountability. So I want to know I want to know that you guys know who the officers involved in those instances were, and I want to know what specific steps are being taken to make sure this doesn't ever happen again. And one more thing, I also want to know what percentage, I would like to know what percentage of resources the GRPD commits yearly toward policing of victimless crimes. These are, drug-related offenses or prostitution, things that are not causing violence, moving homeless people around. I want to know how much of your resources go toward those type of policing activities. I will take my call off the air.
Thank you, caller.
Okay, we did talk about this a little bit at the previous forum, but it's an important thing to share and help the community understand, and that is the question of who's policing the police, what is the accountability process. And I think between Chief and Mr. Davis, maybe we can just take a moment and talk about what, Mr. Davis, your role is now in the process, but also, Chief, what the process is currently from an accountability standpoint.
Sure. We take complaints on officers from citizens. We take anonymous complaints. We take in-person complaints. It's our internal affairs that starts the intake process on investigating allegations of misconduct against police officers. Once the intake is done, that is when the investigation occurs. The internal affairs, they look at the complaint. There's interviews to be done. There's body-worn camera, in-car video camera, video that needs to be reviewed. So that's all part of the process. Once they come up with, at the conclusion of that investigation, I meet with a team of labor relations, city attorney, deputy chiefs. Mr. Davis also participates, and we discuss what the findings are. Internal Affairs make a recommendation, and then I make the final determination for the police department. Now, there's other parts of the process, and I'll let Mr. Davis take it from there to explain as the appeals process.
Sure. So the chief talked about the internal affairs process. Again, the complaint comes into the department. The Internal Affairs Department investigates that, and the chief ultimately is able to make a decision regarding that complaint, meaning the complaint is sustained or it's unfounded, or to use not to use such technical terms. Either it's found that the officer committed the action or the officer did not commit the action. It's probably an easier way for us to say that. After that process, my office now newly will have the ability to look at that investigation and to review the investigation, to see if the investigation was done thoroughly, to see if the investigation was done appropriately, and to opine about the ultimate result of that investigation. In the event that a citizen disagrees with the results of that investigation and it falls within the Civilian Appeals Board's jurisdictional authority, which simply means they have the ability to review those types of cases, then that citizen can appeal to the Civilian Appeals Board. And the Civilian Appeals Board, the best way to think about it is like an appellate court, right? So when it goes to if a criminal case goes to a court of appeals, the Court of Appeals is able to look at the decision that was made at the lower court and change that decision. The Civilian Appeals Board has the same authority here. So our Civilian Appeals Board has the authority to listen and review an investigation that has been completed, and then make the determination to overturn a decision or to confirm a decision that was made by the police department. And that is our current process. It's also important to point out that my office is a new office, and prior to COVID-19 and prior to us being in this position that we're healing these things now, we were in the process of completing our strategic plan and scoping out what the role of the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability would be in all of these types of matters. So we're still building out those procedures. We're still building out that policy, but the current state is what I just described.
And if I may add, I left out a crucial part of that, as Mr. Davis mentioned, the determination of whether the complaint is sustained or not sustained. And in plain talk, whether the officer did the misconduct or it could be proven they did the misconduct. The other part of that is that there's corrective action taken at that point. If it's found that the officer did that, did what the complaint said they did. So it's not just saying yes or no, they did it. If it's found that there was a violation, then we take corrective action. That could be anywhere from a coaching or termination at that point.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on. Let's get another caller on. Mr. Stark, do we have another caller in the queue?
Calling in to say that I am totally in favor of defunding the police and ask that the city cuts the budget from 39% of the general fund to the charter amendment's minimum allowance of 32% by July 1st, so that the city council has called an emergency meeting to fix it because they do have the authority to do so. I know that they're thinking of hiring 3 new officers and 1 trauma-informed specialist. I'd say freeze the hiring of all officers, and instead of 3 new officers, hire 3 new trauma-informed specialists who are actually going to do some good for the community. Recently, being the roughly $9 million saved to public services for communities of color by following allocations of instructions by community leaders who have been doing this work for a long time. Also, in regards to the psych evaluations, speaking once again, as many have already spoken, to the officer who shot that protester point blank in the face with a tear gas canister, it seems like your psych evaluations are allowing a few screws to slip through the matrix there. So forgive me if I don't have a lot of faith in your psych evaluation. I'd also like to point out that Mark Wash Washington made a few comments about how Minneapolis and LA are handling this whole defunding process, and Minneapolis is not does not operate in a vacuum. They're reacting to the system as a whole. And while the occurrence that happened there with George Floyd is an incident that happened specifically in Minneapolis, this is happening all over the world. And for GRPD to be defunded, I think that it is incredibly important for us to follow suit in Minneapolis because, as was mentioned before, tear gas wasn't deployed until public property and private property is being destroyed. And so that just goes to show that the police, as an institution, is created to protect capital, not people. Nobody was hurting anybody else. The police were hurting the people. But when the people started damaging property, that's when the police decided to care because that's where the money is. All in all, I just say that it's disappointing to hear people calling and saying that we need the Grand Rapids Police Department because, as I said before, the Minneapolis Police Department is being dismantled and they're putting in precautions and hiring personnel that are actually trained to handle situations. De-escalation, people who are trained in de-escalation, people who are trained in trauma-informed cases, mental health workers, people who are in the community who are actually qualified to handle the homeless situation, which is something that should not be filtered through the police department at all, because we've seen all over how the homeless are treated by police the country over. So all in all, I think that there needs to be a lot more thought put into this, and I believe that the City Council and the GRPD really need to reconsider the funds for the budget for 2020, starting on July 1st. So emergency meetings to reallocate funds, defund to 32% of the fund. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the call. Mr. Starr, let's move on to our next call.
While we're moving on, I want to make sure we come back and clarify. I heard this several times, and I meant to do it earlier about us adding 3 police officers this year. There were no new ads in the budget for positions for fiscal year 21, and that I heard that caller and the other callers say that before. I just want to clarify that, and I'll ask our CFO to confirm. Perhaps people are seeing something else in the budget around grants or something else, but I just want to clarify that for the public.
Okay, thank you.
All right, caller, can you turn down your volume in the background for me, please? And you're on with the group.
Okay.
You can go. You have 3 minutes.
I have been working in this neighborhood for 30 years. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, but I want to say injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and that's Dr. Martin Luther King. We shouldn't make decisions when we're angry like we are now, and you should be angry at some of the things that has happened. But I want to those will come like emotional decisions, because I would not want a neighborhood where you had nobody protecting anybody, and you can't protect yourself. You can shoot people, but that's not what we're trying to do because we're being violent. But what I'm saying right now, we have people right now in our neighborhood get shot on the street and nobody says anything, and it's hard. How are you going to do if everybody's just running around doing whatever they want to do? You open your city up also for other people coming from other cities taking over your area and your neighborhoods. And I know this for a fact. It happened when I first started working with other cities coming in here trying to take over. And saying that the Grand Rapids Police Department has come a long way. We are comparing them to all the other cities. You know, I want you to stop and think, all the people that are listening here, if you had to walk with a camera on every day, you would stop and think about the decisions that you make. But when you're confronted at a spur-of-the-moment decision, you're thinking about survival of yourself. Use of force, like we saw with Mr. Floyd, is not acceptable anywhere. Excessive force is not acceptable. When the police do wrong, even through my career, I have talked to them and talked to the chiefs. I've worked with 5 different chiefs, and they have changed. They have fired a lot of people. Nobody want to work with somebody that might get them killed or might get them fired. So think about that when we're making our decisions. Now, I'm not saying that the police department is not the only thing where there's racial injustice. We got to look at gap analysis that exist in our services. in different agencies that's supposed to serve us. The health department, you know, everything that's missing. We need to sit down at the table and look at that and try to find out, okay, what's missing and how do we fill those gaps to make a holistic community working together for a purpose of justice and equality. I also want to say back in the day, because I can say that, we used to have what we call beat meetings for South Side, for the West Side, East Side, and it was a meeting where people would sit around the table and all the community-oriented government, like people were there, where you could get a decision for something, like say, even, for instance, just an example, you wanted to put up a sign in the area, you don't know if you could do it or not. The people to answer that question and will walk you through it were right at the table. The same thing with these beat meetings. What's going good? What's going bad? What needs to be changed? Those are the things that we were discussing. But now we don't have enough officers even to do that because of the fact that people are retiring and they're not being replaced. And should we have more training? Yes, we should have more training in all walks of life, not just the police department. Everybody needs training. We need to train our kids. We need to train the neighborhood. It changes constantly. Our neighborhoods have been a lot of them gentrified. And
ma'am, if I can step in for just 1 second, we're up to we're approaching 4 minutes now, and we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity.
Those are just some of my ideas, but I'm willing to help on anything you guys need. Like I said, I've been here for 30 years, so and still here. So thank you for the time, and thank you for the panel.
Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. Let's move on. Get our next caller on.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes for your question or comment. Your time starts now. If you could turn down your volume in the background. Thank you.
So thank you for the time, and thank you for the panel.
Are you there, caller?
Yes, I am.
Can you turn down your volume, please? And
Yes.
You're on. You can go ahead and start with your comment.
Hello. I just want to address really quickly. I want to thank Mr. Davis for addressing the previous caller, the lady, who did not seem to recognize that Black people have a different experience with the police. Perfect example, she does not seem to get what has been happening to us. Another comment concerning the Civilian Appeals Board, I don't know how effective that really is, because officers with complaints and prior incidents these things need to be really addressed, not passed along. They get passed along because legislation is worded to allow officers not to be charged or found to have done anything wrong. So you go through the appeals board, you go through the court system, you don't get charged because of the wording of the law. So we need to work on changing legislation. And the main thing that I wanted to talk about, I just want to get those two things in. I have a son with Down syndrome, and he's 27. And there was an incident at our home 5 years ago. I was coming from the hospital in Ann Arbor. My sister was dying, and we had stayed a little longer, and it had gotten dark. And my husband had just left to go to watch a game at the sports bar because he thought I was going to be home. Well, my son got afraid, I guess, during that time period. He called the police. And he has problems communicating and speaking, especially with strangers. So when the officer came, he ended up pulling my son out of the house, putting him on the ground on our porch, put his knee in my son's back, handcuffed him. My son has asthma, he has a heart condition, and he has kidney disease. I thank the Lord every day, especially when I see these incidents, that my son was not one of these people that died. I'm sorry for all the other mothers who lost their sons and daughters, but I just was so thankful that did not happen to my son, because the officers need to know how to de-escalate a situation. The officer, we went through a whole big process. I don't have time for all that, but the officer actually told my husband and I that he had never seen a Black man with Down syndrome. He said he knew something was wrong
need to get my son out of the house. So my son called 911, and they didn't know what was happening. But they did not try to handle the situation. If there had been a white kid with Down syndrome, because I call it Down Syndrome Association, and no parent ever reported anything like that, although their child had called 911. So I would just like, you did address that the homeless, you have a community police officer, but it gets a little more specific. When you deal with incidents with people with disabilities, you cannot be so forceful. You have to be trained to understand and to be more sympathetic. When my son came home during all this happening, he lives here. They had put my son who has Down syndrome, in the back of a police car. That's never happened to us. And my son called me and said, "Mom, where are you?" There's like 6 police cars at our house. I just hit it. I was like about 10 minutes out. When I got here, they would not let me take my son out of the car. He was begging and crying for his mom. So anyway, we called my husband, and he came. They let my husband take him out of the car. They let my husband take him in the house. I had to stay outside. They threatened with taking me to jail because I was questioning them and demanding to want to know how come I can't get my son out of the car. But they need to be sympathetic to mothers, to people. That whole situation was handled so wrong, and they never apologized. In the end, they said we didn't. We had the city attorney there. They said we didn't do anything wrong, and I said, well, my son would like an apology. Well, we're not going to apologize because we don't think we did anything wrong. So that's how all that ended. So please protect our people with disabilities. Learn to approach them with kindness. Learn to de-escalate a situation. Don't use excessive force when it's not necessary. Don't have a parent there without being able to, just feeling hopeless and helpless. Please change that policy. Address the homeless, but please address these other situations.
Caller, thank you.
Thank you. And I'm really sorry to hear about your experience. And I can't help but offer the city managers opportunity. If you haven't had an apology, you certainly should get that.
Yeah, I too. That was tough listening to the call. I can only imagine how helpless you may have felt with your son so desperately depending on you, and you're being in the middle of that and not being able to advocate or be helpful to him. And I do apologize as well for the pain that you must have felt during that interaction. And while I don't know all the particulars and what happened in that instance, I do appreciate you bringing that to our attention this evening, and would hope that you would reach out to the chief afterwards and give your name right to Mr. Davis to make sure that whatever happened in that instance, that everyone has learned from that, and how we can both respond with both safety as well as empathy in moving forward. And the chief may be familiar with it. I'm unfamiliar. This is the first time I've heard of that matter. But and while I, again, don't know all the particulars of it, I do know not only in our department, but across the nation, police officers are asked to do a lot. And one of the things, we can't expect them to be everything to everyone all the time. And so I do agree that, oftentimes we may need to have some supporting resources, particularly in the area of mental health and interacting with persons with disabilities, to make sure that we have the appropriate resources there. And for that reason, I think not many other departments are trying to make sure that either the officers are better trained at dealing with people with mental health, or they have non-sworn resources to do that. And we attempted to do that with equipping the department with a victim's assistance or victim's advocate person, but that's one person. And perhaps the chief might have other thoughts on how we might make sure we continue to get better in that area.
Yes, sir. Something that has been a focal point of the Kent County area chiefs is delivering to or providing training to our officers on mental health and interaction with people who have disabilities. There's a concerted effort. Sergeant Wachowski is leading it from our department, and we are training officers as classes become available. I believe we're approaching close to 100 of our officers, and new officers are also given that training as they replace officers that retired. So that is a big part of our training moving forward, I believe. And I would like the caller to contact me, but I believe she said that was 5 years ago when this incident occurred. So where we still have work to do, there has been progress made in interaction with people with disabilities by our officers and getting them better trained.
It's probably worthwhile to mention that countywide there's a conversation about creating a mental health crisis center specifically to offer alternatives for people that are having those types of crises, I should say. An alternative to what's traditionally been arrest, jail, things like that. So there's certainly a broader conversation taking place specifically around that, and hopefully we'll see some outcomes soon. Mr. Stark, can we get to our next caller?
Sure thing. Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
My name is Josh Carpenter. I live in the 2nd Ward here in Rapids. I want to thank Chief Payne and Mr. Davis especially for taking the time to explain the accountability process that exists in the city. That's something I was very curious about. And I also want to thank the entire city leadership for taking the time to hear our voices on this. I appreciate that you do that. My question, I think I have a couple comments here and then a specific question. Looking at the first slide that Mr. Davis shared, or sorry, that Chief Payne shared, I saw a lot of, where possible or whenever possible, police officers will, avoid deholstering their weapon or using excessive force, or whenever possible, another cop is to intervene to another police officer to ensure that excessive use of force isn't happening. But then in the description of the accountability process, it seems like you guys rely solely on the complaints made by individuals who have been policed and feel like they were policed wrongly. That's an important part of the accountability process.
Sorry, was that the end of the call or did we lose the caller?
No, are you still there, caller? You're breaking up.
Here, okay. Hello.
Yep.
Yeah, you're still breaking up a little bit.
Oh, okay. Is this getting any better?
Yep, that's better.
Okay. I think an important part of the accountability process, in addition to taking those complaints from citizens who feel, what was that? Oh, I know they're telling. Sorry, my wife's yelling at me. The accountability process should include random reviews from the Civilian Review Board, and also all data that the police have on stops and racial data should be made available to them, because I think it's unreasonable to expect that everyday citizens are going to have a deep understanding of the complexities of that process to know when a police officer has exhausted all other possibilities before resorting to force. So I'm advocating that you guys have an actual civilian oversight that has some teeth for the police review process, because I think whether it is or not, and I don't know in Grand Rapids whether it is, but it's important that the citizens believe that the accountability process is open and fair to citizens and not happening behind closed doors and potentially subject to police union influence that may not have all of our best interests at hand. So that's kind of my comment. And my question is whether the internal budget of the police is available anywhere online. for us citizens to review. I've been looking around for it. I'd like to see where that money is going. And so far, I haven't been able to find it. So if anybody could give me some direction on that or explain whether that will be made available if it isn't currently, I would appreciate that. And I'll yield the rest of my time to other callers. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. Yeah, there's been a number of questions and comments in relation to the budget. We have our published budget, but there's questions about the specifics beyond the object codes or commodity codes for various categories of services. I don't know if that's an answer that we can provide absent the CFO.
Yeah, I think what they're asking for is more transparency in the police budget, and perhaps that's something the chief and Mr. Davis can work on outside this meeting. And from a programmatic perspective, that probably would be a good place to start there.
Okay.
Mr. Matthews?
Yes, sir.
To the caller's other point, related to the studies of traffic stop data and things of that nature, that is one of the charges of the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability. So we will be doing that research that the caller specifically just asked about. We'll be looking at those things, and we will be reporting publicly on those things, including reporting to the Public Safety Committee and to Commission and to the public as appropriate. The Office of Oversight and Public Accountability plans to publish at least 2 reports annually that will be extensive reports related to our findings and our activity up to that point. It will also publish additional reports on subject-specific information. Those reports will be made available on the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability's website, as well as on our social media sites.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Mr. Starr, let's get to our next caller.
Good. Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Yes. Hi, my name is Colin. I am a resident of Grand Rapids. First, I just kind of wanted to address what was already kind of mentioned regarding last week's protest and police officers not wearing badges or identity. It was also there. And when protesters even asked police officers to identify themselves, they refused. What's even more interesting and upsetting is that the police chief was also within the vicinity of these officers. So I know he was aware of this. And I think it says a lot about his character, considering he should be the leading example for these officers. So I just kind of wanted to point that out, but I'm going to move on because I think we talked about, I'm in support of the reallocating of funds as well. And in the previous slide, you had mentioned that we are in a recession. And as I quote, there is a high demand for policing resources, kind of poses a challenge to these reallocating of funds. So my question is, what policing resources are you prioritizing over the community? You know, regarding education, housing, mental and social health, healthcare. You know, we as a community demand that you give us full transparency of what these funds are going to. If you claim that we are your number one priority, then you should make this be your number one priority. Tell us where these funds are going. I use the rest of my time.
Yeah, I'll just begin. I want to thank the caller for the question. Now, we spent about 5 or 6 weeks very deliberately unpacking the budget based on our strategic priorities and being very specific around where the funding investments were going. And the priority during the budget process was to try to maintain all essential services, and certainly housing, as well as public safety, water, and other things that add to our quality of life was essential. I didn't want to cut anything that would affect essential services, street maintenance, et cetera. And so those were conversations. And unfortunately, this town hall, we've had several town halls that were related to the budget. I think at least a couple of town halls and public hearings, and we were very transparent during that process. be happy if the caller would like to share their name and number. Our CFO could follow up with them and provide additional information as needed.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. Let's move on to our next caller.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Hi, thank you all so much for hosting this. I know the community really appreciates these kind of open forums. I really want to echo the kind of concerns that a lot of the people, especially the couple callers before me, have had about concerns in funding transparency. Regarding the city charter that requires the minimum of 32% of the city budget to go to the police, I was curious, how was that percentage determined? If you folks have the answer to that, and why was it set? I think I saw it 39% this year. And then, following up on what I think many of other people have asked, is the police budget publicly available, especially outlining the percentages of funds that are allocated to different departments or initiatives in the GRPD? And if not, can it be? I know I'm really interested in the report that Mr. Washington was just talking about, with the different transparency and demographics. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, unfortunately, I'm institutionally, I don't have the history. Maybe the chief can, but I know that there were several matters that was put before the public, and that was the commitment that the public wanted in terms of making sure that the police department had minimum funding necessary, and the chief can maybe give some context as to why it went to public vote. But the overall percentage this year, if I'm correct, is relatively lower than last year of the total budget, and we can get that information out. But Chief, do you have any context when the 32% was established? I think it was 2010 or something like that. I can't remember when.
Yes, it was put to the public and they voted. It was a vote by the public or the community to establish that 32% that the general fund be allocated toward the police.
And that was through a citizen petition to amend the charter?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Were we having any issues around public safety at that time, Chief?
We were. It was actually back in the 90s, and I don't, Mr. DeLong may have the exact time and more details, but I do know it was a public vote.
There we go. There's our historian right there.
Yes. Here I am. Woke me up. So it was a vote that was done during the tenure of Mayor Logie, and it was established to increase the actually police staffing at the time. And so it was tied to an increase in the income tax. And so the trade-off was that the citizens were asked to vote for an increase in the income tax in return for a floor, essentially, for the funding of the investment in the police department. And that it passed and went into place. And it was pegged to a number that was developed back at that time. I don't recall the details of the number, but that's the genesis of it. So it was actually about police staffing and a public vote to increase the amount of income tax paid by local residents.
Thank you, Mr. DeLong, for the guest appearance.
You're welcome.
So let's see if we can get to another caller. I know we've got at least 21, 22 people still on the line.
Caller, welcome to the forum. If you can turn down your volume, please. You have 3 minutes for your question. Your time starts now.
Hi, yes. I'm under the assumption, or I'm under the assumption that currently right now, Grand Rapids Public Police Department individuals are being employed by the Grand Rapids school system in order to provide public services for them. I think that's pretty abhorrent, just because we all know that the cops really aren't there for the people. So I'm just wondering, a couple things. First of all, are there going to be any reports done on use of force complaints within schools and or use of force incidents within schools that police have done? And also, why? No, actually, that's all I have. Yeah. Is there going to be any data regarding police use of force within the Grand Rapids public school system?
Chief, I don't know if you can address. I'm fairly certain that the school system has their own policing, correct?
They do. They have a security team. We occasionally work different events at their request, football games and different things like that. But we also have a good partnership with the schools where officers interact within the schools. They're not dedicated resource officers for the school, but we do have officers that are they go to the different schools in their area and interact with them. As far as the use of force is mentioned, we hope to get before public safety, and we will our annual report that will have our use of force numbers for 2019 in it, and it will be made public.
Yep. But just to be clear, regarding to the I would say the interoperability among all agencies in the area, not only the school district, but you have good relationships with the GRPS, and I thought that you had members of your team in contact frequently with their senior staff there. Mr. Johnson, as I recall, but perhaps Chief, I think what we need to let the caller know is that I think the school district is very comfortable, as far as I'm aware, of handling all of their issues and only calling us as needed when there are actual crimes that are committed. Am I correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct. We're only called if it's necessary. Their team is more than capable of basically providing security for their schools and working with their students. It's when a criminal act that they cannot. That's not their function. Is when we're called.
We have no interest in policing the schools.
No.
Thank you for that clarification. Mr. Starr, let's move to our next caller.
Caller, welcome to the forum. If you can turn down your volume in the background, please.
Hi.
You've got.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you got 3 minutes. Your time starts now.
Okay. Thank you for taking my call. My name is Ashlyn. I'm a proud teacher. I've taught in GRPS as well as Godwin schools. As a teacher, I've actually had students who've been held at gunpoint by GRPD, as many people remember. 5 students who were held at gunpoint coming home from a basketball game at 13 years old and so on. As a teacher, I've also had homeless students. I've had students who are struggling with poverty. And I know working with these students that they need resources more than they need such an enormous police department that has at times directly hurt them and caused that trauma. So more specifically, I have 2 questions and a comment. So first, my question is, how does the city of GR and how does GRPD plan to respond to the increasing research that's showing that militarizing police leads to an actual increase in police violence? And I'm referencing studies such as the 2017 study by Delahanty and Myers, Militarization and Police Violence, where they found that increases in riot gear, weapons, tear gas, etc., actually lead to increases of police violence. So that's my first question. My second question, well, it starts off with a comment. So police officers, they're not social workers, they're not teachers, they aren't counselors, and we need those in our community. We have those jobs in our community, and we need more of them. And when we talk about defunding the police, which I'm an advocate for. We also talk about refunding these community resources that have been shown to prevent crime and to treat the source of it. Sources such as poverty, mental illness, and addiction. These are known sources of crime. So there's a 2017, longitudinal study, a 30-year study by Sharkey, and they found for every 10 nonprofits that were added in the city, there was a decrease by 9% in murder, 6% decrease in violent crime, 4% decrease in property crime. And we can see that funding community resources prevents crime. It's not just punishing it. It's not terrorizing young Black kids. It's preventing crime. So my second question is this. How does the city of Grand Rapids plan to respond to this research that shows that funding nonprofits and community resources prevents crime, especially in the face of a recession? So I want to know how GR is working on preventing crime instead of increasing the punishing of it. And just lastly, my comment is that I want to add to my voice to the community's desire to have an emergency meeting to defund GRPD to the minimum of 32%. No new hires, and increased funding from community resources, and eventually, as another caller has talked about, lowering this minimum and relooking at that charter, and looking to Minneapolis as a potential model for defunding the police. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. So we had two questions there. I don't know, Chief, Mr. Davis, if either of you is familiar with the research that was referenced.
I am not. What I will do, though, is ask my training staff to look into it. We certainly are open to getting all information. I'll just say, though, what we have found is that we need the necessary tools to do our job and making sure we're trained to do it properly. But we certainly can take a look at those studies.
And the second question had to do with alternative investments, had to do with investing in community organizations and community resources and how that translates over into crime prevention activities. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about the other side of policing, which is the crime prevention activity, what it is that GRPD does, and maybe what are some of the things that we've got on the horizon or that we have in the plan.
Well, we've had we've had a great relationship with our neighborhood associations and working with them. We have a crime prevention organizer that we staff here at the police department that works very closely with our service area captains, our investigative captains, and liaison with the neighborhood associations. That's an investment that has been around since it's been here for over 30 years that I know of. It's very crucial to us with working with the public. As far as investing in other initiatives, that is certainly something that we've taken a look at. But I'm not familiar with the study she mentioned there also, where the reduction is seen in investing. But I would say that the things around crime and different things, it's not just a police issue. I mean, that are in play there. There's, as she mentioned, poverty, education, employment. So there's a lot of other factors that interplay when crime occurs, and those that are affected by it.
Chief, I think to the caller's point, and certainly I'm not the law enforcement expert, but what I've heard is many conversations around everyone's using the term militarizing, but there was quite a few conversations around warrior versus guardian concept, where the traditional response of the department or in the past have been, with these tactical responses with lots of weaponry and militarizing, and to use the term. But I think what people are asking, what other things can we do, or are we doing that's not traditional policing, that's more community oriented, that's human centric, that tries to look at, as you said, some of the other social things that are happening in our community that affect lifestyles of people, poverty, that lends themselves to more interaction with policing. And I think that's what I'm hearing from a lot of people who are asking to reconsider how we fund the department. And I guess my thoughts are, it's not just a matter of how we fund departments, but it's what else do we invest in?
Sure.
And what we're being asked now is to make a choice, defund this to fund something else. And that's certainly one way of looking at it, but there may be other ways of trying to invest in those other resources as well.
Yeah, you make a good point there. I will say that the traditional way of solving crime problems was to flood the area with police officers. That is something that we have gotten away from. I value non-enforcement contacts. Officers having the resources and knowing how to direct people to resources that can help them in the community. As she mentioned, there's a lot of there's social workers out there. I mean, there's places that can help people. So we've made a huge emphasis on those type of contacts that officers have with the community, as opposed to trying to solve problems strictly for. We'll never arrest our way out of the problems. It is what we do, is what we're tasked with. But what I'm looking to do is be more specific, or looking at things that are committing violent acts in neighborhoods. So that's where our focus on, as opposed to a neighborhood itself, and working more closely with the neighborhoods.
All right. Thank you, Chief. Mr. Start, let's see if we can get a few more callers in before 7 o'clock.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Hello, my name is Robert Campbell. I live in the Hartside neighborhood of downtown, and I actually had a few things that I wanted to bring up, but due to my concern that you guys will just totally bypass this issue and ignore it, I'm going to be very direct and only ask you, what is the status of the investigation regarding the man who was shot in the face with a tear gas canister? Thank you.
Thank you, caller. We did address that at the beginning of the community meeting. If we have some time, we'll see if we can recap that again. But I do want to make sure that we get to as many callers as we can right now.
Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Okay, so hi, my name is Anna. I'm the co-founder of Justice for Black Lives. What I would like to know is, what will the consequences be for the officer that threw the tear gas canister in that man's face unprovoked?
Is that your only question, caller?
I have more questions. I was just hoping to answer that one first.
Nope, go ahead and
okay. Well, that one was actually addressed at the top of the meeting, and in the interest of getting as many questions answered as we can, let us know what else you have.
Okay, so what I would also like to know is, for the chief, why did you pick this? I mean, you canceled our meeting earlier to do a press conference, but there was already this one happening. So I don't know. I'm just a little confused. Do you actually want to meet with us or no?
Yeah. Yes, I do want to meet with you, and I'd like to make arrangements to meet with you again. So we'll try to set that up.
Well, let me also add a couple of things. One, apologies if there was someone that the chief was scheduled to meet with. I called the chief in to a meeting, and he honored my request to meet, and I think he sent staff to the meeting. So I was unaware of the commitment that he made and whether or not that would be honored. So I would, my apologies if that caused any confusion, but what we're trying to do is be as transparent as possible. Is she still on there?
Yep.
So
I'm sorry?
when do you want to have our meeting then, Chief?
When?
Caller, I don't know if community forum is the best time to have a back and forth and check calendars and make a schedule. I know that the chief's committed to continuing to meet and continuing to engage. So if you have another question, we're happy to get to it, but we do have at least 20 other people on the line we want to make sure that we get to.
Okay, I'll ask the question then. So last thing I want to know is who approved tear gas in the pandemic the respiratory system? That's dangerous. You know that?
What is your question?
That's my question.
The question was who authorized tear gas in the middle in the throes of a pandemic?
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Okay.
As I explained, what we had was a peaceful protest that turned unlawful, point where rocks and bottles and bricks were being thrown at officers. We made announcements.
I was there.
Okay, announcements were made that this is now an unlawful assembly and asking the crowd to disperse. Furthering that was when property started to be damaged. Further announcements were made. Then I made the decision to use chemical agents to disperse the crowd. So it was my decision.
Okay, thank you, Chief.
It wasn't a good decision, but that's all I had to say. Bye.
Thank you. Let's move on to our next caller.
Caller, welcome to the forum. If you could turn down your volume for us, please.
Chemical agents to
In the background. Awesome. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Hi. I'm interested in a couple of things. First, there's been a lot of chatting during this town hall where people really just want the basic numbers of what the budget is. What is the total city budget that was originally approved to start July 1? What is the amount of money that 32% of that budget, which is the minimum for the police department as per the city charter, what dollar amount is that? And what dollar amount is in the current July 1st budget? So that's my first question. And then when it comes to how money is spent, there was a lot of investment made in bringing a group called Cure Violence to Grand Rapids to talk about their programming. And it would be a $4 million line item to bring them in for, I believe it was a 2-year period. And I'm wondering where that stands. Is that one of the initiatives that you explored that you referred to earlier, Chief Payne? And then thirdly, I want to say that the Chief Payne and the city manager have been very responsive to neighborhood associations. I work for the Creston Neighborhood Association, and it was very important and very helpful to have the community police specialist program extended in order to have a community police specialist available in the evening and on weekends as well as during business hours during the week, which was the original program. So if we could have those numbers, please, and an understanding of where we stand with looking at bringing in Cure Violence, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you. City Manager, I don't know if you want to speak to the general budget question. I know we've had a lot of questions about the specifics within that, but it may benefit the folks that are watching to know what the broad strokes are on the budget to at least answer that question.
And I don't want to misspeak. I had our CFO run the numbers on what it would be at 32% versus 39% for fiscal year 21. And Ms. Claren, if you're on here, you can come on and help me. But I can answer the last one on cure violence. We still have money funded in the budget for that, $75,000. That was the seed money. We still have not spent it. I think the plan was try to get other investments, grants, and philanthropy. And I know there are still conversations around that. They did come in and do a preliminary assessment, and we had a range of how to fund these violence disruption programs, from as little as $300,000 to, as the caller indicated, multi-million dollars. So what we'll do, since that has been such a widely asked question, when we report to the City Commission on Tuesday 16th, we'll make sure that our CFO is able to be very clear with commissioners and public on the funding issues in the police department.
Thank you, City Manager. So we have time to take one more phone call, but before we do that, I do want to reiterate what I said before. If you've asked questions, made comments via social media, whether it be Facebook or YouTube, we're logging all of those conversations to make sure that we have the full context to continue this conversation. We understand that what we're doing tonight is a small part of a bigger initiative that's going to involve not just the police, not just the city, but the community and our residents as well. So if we don't get to your call, same thing, stay on the line. We have people that are going to be available. We're going to take every call. We're going to take every question. And then we're going to go back and we're going to do our best to be able to provide answers to all of them. So, Mr. Stark, can we get to one more before we go?
Certainly. Caller, welcome to the forum. You have 3 minutes to ask your question. Your time starts now.
Hi, my name is Taya, and I'm a resident of the West Side. I just wanted to make a comment on the May 30th use of tear gas. I was at that protest. It was peaceful, and the first use of tear gas was just a few minutes after 8 o'clock. I have that on video from a friend of mine who was also there. There was no violence and no looting happening then. None of that even happened until well after 9 o'clock. So that is just a flat-out lie that there was anything that the protesters did to verify or whatever, call for the use of tear gas. I'd also like to say that when we say we want to defund the GRPD, that doesn't mean no cops tomorrow. It means that over time, we take the funding that has gone to a violent, racist, militarized department and use it to create and maintain community support systems, especially for those in the Black community, as they have seen the least support over decades. These support systems would and do lower crime and increase safety and equity. You should cut the budget down to 32%, and then we'll change that charter. I also, like everyone else, am urging the city to release an interdepartmental breakdown of GRPD's budget and spending, and that budget must remain public for every year. Obviously, your citizens want and deserve to know where our money is going. And I'd like to say thank you to Brandon Davis on this. Hope you keep this energy up. I feel like you're one of the few leaders on our side. Thank you.
Thank you, caller.
Thank you for the call. Mr. Washington, did you have anything that you wanted to say before we sign off for now?
I want to thank all the callers for their questions and time, and thank again the staff, the chief, Mr. Davis, Mr. Strum, and you, Mr. Matthews, and all the staff that's on the back line, Mr. Start and Becky Joe, Ms. Glover, Perez, everyone. Thank you for your help, and Travis, Mr. Scott, appreciate your support. And I just invite the public to, we're in my view, we're making progress. We hear the concerns, and this is a journey. We're going to continue that journey on the 16th. So please tune in and call in if you're able to.
Thank you. And indeed, this is a journey, and it's one that I think every one of us is committed towards. I want to thank everybody that took the time to watch, everybody that took the time to call, everybody that took the time to tune in via social media, and look forward to continuing this conversation over the long term. I'll
get in trouble if I didn't thank Ms. Glover and her team as well.
Absolutely. The crack team at 311, thanks to all of you, and we'll see you again. Good night.